Things are rolling today. We are recording. Welcome. For folks who just joined, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, and I'll just do a brief welcome before we get started today. Good morning. My name is Ashley Rood. I'm from Oregon Climate and Agriculture Network. Welcome to session 3 of our October 2022 Climate Resilience Training for Oregon Ag Professionals. Today's topic is a look at real-world examples for implementing adaptation and resilience actions on the land in the Pacific Northwest. And as we gather on a day when Western Oregon has yet to see significant rain, and I'm talking to you from Portland with very smoky skies, it's a really good day to hear some stories of hope and perseverance. Thank you to all who were able to attend last Wednesday. I really appreciate the positive feedback we've been getting from attendees via our anonymous form and through some generous emails that folks have been sharing with us about your experiences. Please keep those emails coming and let us know what's not working for you, as well as what's going well. For folks who have missed either of our first 2 sessions, you can check out recordings and resources in a Google Drive folder. And Emmerich, when you get a chance, if you could share that, that would be great in the chat. So we're gathered here in the Zoom room with colleagues from across the state and even from further afield to take time each Wednesday to bring the idea of climate resilience on Oregon's farms and ranches into focus. For those of you who've attended earlier sessions, you've heard a little bit of this before, but I think it's really important to remember why we're here doing these workshops. I think we're here because we can't do this work alone. We can't do this within our usual boxes, disconnected. One agency over there, nonprofits over here, and researchers a little somewhere else. We need to connect, and we're gathered here today to do just that, to create a community of practice dedicated to supporting farmers and ranchers working for climate resilience in Oregon. We want to make resilience tangible and accessible over this series with both place-based knowledge and science guiding the way. We've also heard that you really need that place-based information, tools, and partners. So you'll see a theme that we've been hitting on throughout the workshops, and we're going to continue today, where we're going to have facilitated regional breakout rooms for you to get some conversation and problem solving going with people that you work most closely with. I'm thankful that one of our planning team members, Gordon Jones, put together the slides that opened up the session. That was a visualization of who's registered for this event. We've got OSU Extension, a lot of folks from NRCS, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, and nonprofits. And a lot of you are working at the statewide level, and many, of course, in the Willamette Valley and others sprinkled throughout the state. Thank you for being willing and ready to meet and interact with your colleagues. I'm so excited about the depth of knowledge in this room. During workshops, as we gather, let's embrace a few grounding agreements. Let's all gather with respect for others by listening with curiosity. Let's speak from our own personal experiences, and let's allow time for others to share. Some quick Zoom guidelines. We're trying to keep this as interactive and engaging as possible. So let's keep those screens on and keep yourselves muted when appropriate. You can use the chat, but keep conversation relevant to the main presentation. And if you want a reminder of what we'll cover today, our agenda is online. And Megan, who is also going to be paying attention to the chat today, can throw that agenda there soon. And you'll see that we're going to be flowing through breakout rooms and then seeing presentations, and we'll have questions after each presenter today. Just as we're going to need an interdisciplinary community of practice to move farming for climate resilience forward in Oregon, I really needed an interdisciplinary team to pull off this Western SARE funded program in collaboration with OSU Extension. So I want to thank all the folks on the planning team for helping me put this together. If you could raise your hand so we can see you on the screen, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thanks again to all of you for attending today. I know it's not easy to carve out time for learning and building community, but we really can't do this alone. And with that kind of as a theme, we're going to continue with what we've done every other workshop, where we're going to kick off this session with a brief breakout room with one other person. And we'll just have quick 5 minutes in the rooms when we go ahead and do that. So today, when you go into your first breakout room, please provide your name, your affiliation, your location, and answer the question, what is something you hope to learn today? So what is something you hope to learn today? And again, this is just so that you get to meet some folks since we're not in person. And with that, Emmerich, are you feeling ready to send us off into those small breakout rooms?
Yeah, it looks like everybody's got a partner. I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording. Just so folks know, we won't be recording anything in any breakout sessions, just when we're all here in the main room. So you should see that prompt to join a breakout room in a second here.
Share in the chat. Feel free to share in the chat any reflections you have from that quick breakout room. Thanks for that. I think it's so important for us to find ways of connecting when we can't do the spontaneous bumping into each other over the coffee table since we're not in person. So thanks. So with that, I'm going to go into introducing our panel, which I'm really excited about, or our presenters. You know, having real world examples of climate resilience on farms in the Pacific Northwest is so critical. As the planning team for this year's event looked at what worked during last year's training, and perhaps most importantly, what really is most effective in your day-to-day work, having real examples of what climate resilience looks like on farms is essential. Seeing what works on the land also really captivates many of us in this space. I know it does for myself in particular. The tangibility of it can really spark ideas like no other. We all know organizing a field tour is really challenging, so we're bringing the field tour to you today. Before we dig in, I'll just add that what's so creative, energizing, and challenging about climate resilience on farms and ranches is that it looks really different in different cropping systems and different ecosystems. I love the opportunity for creativity that lies in this complexity. It also makes it really hard to pick what examples we are going to share today. So in thinking through what we wanted to focus on, we looked at themes of land management for drought resilience, while also wanting to look at innovative practices on different kinds of farms in different regions. And I'm excited about the mix of examples we'll have. We're going to kick things off with a more regional perspective with an example from the Nez Perce tribe. And then we'll move into an example of a grass-fed beef operation in Southwest Oregon with Martin Family Farms. And we'll show what a producer-driven research project looks like with Powell and Katie Swanson. And last but not least, Pryor Garnett will share his larger scale organic operations story. One of the things I love about all of these speakers is that I see in all of their work a curiosity, a drive to continue learning. They don't have it all figured out and they're game to experiment. I find this approach really collaborative with really generative results. With that, I'd like to introduce Stefanie Krantz and Eric Walsh. I've been learning from the work they've been doing for a few years now and the holistic ecological lens with which they do their work, as well as their passion and innovation keep me really inspired. Stefanie is the climate change coordinator for the Nez Perce tribe. She works on planning, tools, and funding for climate change adaptation and mitigation projects. She studied agricultural ecology and has a passion for biodiversity, soil health, drought resilience, and economic vitality for rural and tribal communities. And then Eric is Manomet's Climate Smart Land Network Program Director and an adjunct professor at University of Idaho. Before working for Manomet, he was a climate change specialist with the Nez Perce tribe. He worked with the tribe and farmers to address climate change vulnerabilities, specifically focusing on developing pathways toward climate smart adoption. And with that, we can pass it off to them. Stefanie, I think you've got the slides.
Okay, does everybody see?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Ashley, and everyone that's here today. I know the Nez Perce tribe is actually not located in Oregon, but part of the Nez Perce tribe's ancestral lands are in Oregon and Washington. And they still do a lot of land management activities in Oregon and Washington. The examples that we're giving you today are actually in Idaho, but with similar ecosystems as Eastern Oregon. So first of all, you know, I don't know how many folks are aware that there's a network of tribes in the Pacific Northwest and throughout the United States that are working on climate change, adaptation, planning, and resilience. The Bureau of Indian Affairs funds a lot of this work, and they've been working on it for a long time. Tribal members live close to the land. They depend upon subsistence, hunting, fishing, and gathering, and they have an incredible record of what this landscape was like in the past. and knowledge about how to manage for native species. They also farm the wild, and a lot of my work, I'm not going to talk about this today, but it is about native plant preservation for cultural survival. This image is a picture of the Lapwai Community Garden. Unfortunately, we have to move the Lapwai Community Garden. It's going to be in a new location, but this garden was started by nurses that care about diabetes. It wasn't necessary, it was sort of a grassroots thing where a couple of nurses got in touch with someone from wildlife and started a garden here. And it's been a catalyst for a food sovereignty movement at the tribe. So the tribe now has a food committee and plans for an annual food summit, and is trying to work on finding ways to have more local food production and more control of our food supply and what's in it. So I work with Eric and have worked with him for several years, but I also want to point out that Justin Matthias is a grad student or a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Idaho, and he is working on the research project that we're doing. This slide depicts our motto about working on climate change: start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. It's also the outline for this talk. So, if you take a look at this landscape, you can see the Snake River on the left coming north from, southern Idaho. The Clearwater River meets it and flows into Washington. The Nez Perce Reservation, as you can see, is largely under some form of cultivation. There's many dissected canyon lands on the reservation and remnants of forests. Most of the forests are in places that were too steep to farm and to convert to some kind of cropping system. Those canyons are very important for biological diversity on the reservation and for movement of wildlife and pollinators, etc. There are wolves, moose, elk, mule deer, and many other native wildlife species on the reservation that pass through farms. The reservation is surrounded to the west by farmlands on the Powell Prairie, and on the east by the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, and is located in the Clearwater Subbasin. So we're looking at this entire landscape and looking at our climate vulnerabilities. On the reservation, one of the biggest issues is flooding. So the eastern edge of the reservation, where that canyon just goes right along the edge of the reservation, there are the communities of Kuski, Kamei, Orofino, Lenore, and Lapwai. And those communities regularly flood. And roads wash out and mudslides happen, etc. In addition, there have been a number of large forest fires on the reservation in the last 5 or 6 years that have caused a lot of economic damage and mudslides and sedimentation of salmon streams. The Nez Perce tribe and the Nez Perce people, the Nimipu, are salmon people. They care about salmon above all. And this landscape used to be fed by the salmon coming from the ocean and bringing all those nutrients. There's salmon DNA in the trees. And it's the most important thing to the tribe. And so looking at this situation, what's happening with climate change, what's happening to farmers, the flood issues and the projections that show that this landscape is going to be a lot drier, we're really trying to figure out how to improve soil health and water quality and water retention across the landscape, and to help farmers who are already experiencing these incredible economic impacts from climate change. The Nez Perce tribe's largest source of revenue is leasing to farmers. Agriculture is extremely important to the tribe. And when droughts come through and farmers have total losses, it affects the entire economy of the region. So it's important to us. This slide shows what crops are produced on the reservation. As you can see, almost all of it is winter and spring wheat, and obviously hay and pasture. There are some other crops produced here, including grapes for wine, garbanzos and lentils, etc., that are important to farmers. here are just a few images of the kinds of impacts the tribe is experiencing. Last summer, during the extreme drought and heat wave, at my house one day it was 122 degrees. At the high school down the street, it was also 122 degrees. The official record at the airport, which is about 700 feet higher than my house, was 117 degrees. One of the farms that had this incredible success using regenerative agriculture techniques last year, their highest days were well over 100 degrees. Almost all the farms on the reservation had total losses. It was not even worth harvesting because there were so few grains in the fields. And they used crop insurance or lost their farms or had a total loss. People sold their cattle. They turned out their cattle on what little wheat they actually grew. It was something sort of apocalyptic. But one of the stories that we want to tell today is about this farmer, Eric Hasselstrom, who has been doing regenerative ag techniques for a while and has had a lot of success. He doesn't use as many inputs as his neighbors and he's saving money. But then last year he trialed this totally new system. The first year he'd ever used it. It's called bioactive, and basically it involves taking exhaust from the tractor, mixing it with water and a soil inoculant, and then injecting it into the soil. He pulled off a wheat crop and a garbanzo crop and cover crops. And when we went to visit his farm, midsummer, he had plants growing when all of his neighbors were dry as a bone with nothing growing. He had already hayed his cover crops, and we went to his cover crop field and it had resprouted and it had flowers in it in a time when there were no flowers anywhere on the landscape. The protein values in his wheat were perfect for selling it, and his garbanzo beans were larger. So he was able to sell his crop for the highest value. This is after one season of trying a new technology in a drought that involved focusing on soil health. He is an early adopter and he would like to get rewarded for the risks that he has taken. His neighbors are very interested in what he's doing, but there's a social cost for doing new things here. And it can be embarrassing and difficult to get over it. His wife produces lamb that they graze on their farmlands and in their forest patches. And she gets the value add for direct sales of her lamb. And so it all kind of works together. They have animals integrated into their system. They're doing some soil health things, and they have been for a while. And now they're doing this new technology that helps improve soil health. So, we're pretty interested in what farmers are already doing. There are salmon safe farmers here. 70% of the farmers on the reservation are already doing cover or no-till agriculture, unlike the rest of the landscape where it's only 20%. That's in part because of a collaboration between the tribe and the NRCS. And the soil conservation districts. So, the Nez Perce tribe has a land services program that does ag leasing, but they don't have an agricultural management program. This year is the first year they're going to have an ag plan. And we're really trying to help them integrate climate change into their planning processes, not only for, ag management, but also for forestry, hazard mitigation, wildlife, et cetera, and water resource management. The tribe maintains a biocontrol program and does a lot of research that's important for the whole region for exotic invasive plants and insects. The tribe has university partnerships, an active food committee, a huge commitment to climate change solutions, grant writers. We have awesome farmers that are already doing some of these techniques here, and other farmers that are interested in doing something new. And then, of course, extension agents and traditional ecological knowledge. I'm going to pass this off to Eric now.
Thank you, Stefanie. So I'm hoping my video works because I had some earlier issues in the breakout room. So I'm going to talk about kind of just shifting a little bit and discussing how the Nez Perce tribe, through our climate change vulnerability assessments and the work surrounding that, started to identify agriculture as a possible solution across this landscape. Because as Stefanie said, the landscape is almost 50% in agricultural land cover. And so we quickly realized that if we were going to address the vulnerability of the reservation and the tribe itself to climate change, then this major land use needed to be addressed. And we started to look at what are some of the possibilities, and we came up with climate smart ag as one of the frameworks or approaches that we could take. And climate smart ag, to just kind of ground it in a definition, is these three pillars, if you will. The first pillar being that, as a producer, or you are looking at how can I optimize my production systems to mitigate climate change? How can the second pillar is how can I optimize my production systems to adapt to climate change? And in the traditional sense of climate smart ag, the third pillar is how do I intensify my production while meeting those first two pillars? I kind of like to extend that third pillar a bit to align more with what climate smart forestry considers the third pillar, which is not just the intensification of production, but really thinking about the sustainability of still producing ecosystem services across your landscape, or benefits. And those ecosystem benefits, three really top ones I think that are worth noting are the provisioning services. So producing food and fiber off your landscape and intensifying that production to meet global demand, right? The second service, I think, that are benefit of the ecosystem that I think we need to maintain sustainability is that climate regulation piece. So thinking about how can we ensure that we are sequestering carbon and that our systems are greenhouse gas neutral at worst, or negative, meaning that we are extracting more carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in the terrestrial landscape than we are emitting it to the atmosphere. And so that climate.
Yeah, that's Stefanie.
And then the third one is ecosystem benefits. So thinking about how agriculture can act in concert across the landscape to still ensure ecological benefits, habitat for species, both fauna and flora. So an example in this case would be for the tribe, thinking about how agricultural lands can ensure traditional foods and plants are still available across the landscape, and they're not acting as a countercurrent to that production. And so what we did was we looked at, well, we got some BIA funding, Bureau of Indian Affairs funding, to do a climate smart situation analysis across the reservation. And really what we were trying to identify is where's the opportunities for climate smart ag to step into this sphere? What sort of barriers do we need to overcome? What is already occurring within the agricultural systems that align well with climate smart ag, and building on kind of regenerative ag principles. And that last part of identifying what's already happening or occurring, Stefanie had mentioned this, but through previous work and efforts by the tribe to bring no-till agriculture to the reservation and to farmers that lease lands from the tribe, in an effort to address water quality issues, they have a high adoption across the reservation for no-till ag, somewhere in the percentage of 80 to 85% of the lands under farming practices are considered under either no-till or partial no-till practices. And so, we looked at it and said, okay, that's something to build off of. That's something that we can use, understand how we were able to make those inroads with no-till, and see how we can make inroads with other regenerative ag practices like cover cropping and ensuring that you don't have bare soils, which incidentally actually happens at a low implementation rate across the reservation. And so our climate smart situation analysis kind of spotlighted things like that and gave us a pathway forward. Next slide, please, Stefanie. And so what we did was we built off of the BIA grant, that situation analysis, and we went after a National Institute for Food and Agriculture grant, or a NIFA grant, to look at, okay, how do we now begin to build bridges with producers and the tribe and extension agents and the university, et cetera. I think as Ashley had mentioned in the introduction, kind of a community of practice, if you will. How do we get these groups talking to each other to support the adoption of practices that would be more climate smart or more conducive to farming under climate change, and bringing these entities together? And what we found was, through our work, is you have kind of producers across the entire spectrum. You have producers like Eric that Stefanie was mentioning that are already implementing practices. And so you want to be able to step in and support them in terms of quantifying the impact that they're actually having. So that if there is opportunity in the future, and even right now with carbon markets, that they're able to capitalize on that service or benefit that they're providing through their lands and their production. And then you have other producers who they know they need to make change, and they would like to make changes because they're recognizing that what they have been doing, or what previous generations had done, just isn't working anymore because of climate change. But they don't know where to start, and they don't know how to move forward. And so part of the grant was looking at, well, how can we support those producers who are ready to make changes in their production systems, even if they're incremental, but they really don't know where to begin to do that. And then the third part of this that we looked at was the tribe itself, and asking, how can we support the tribe and some of their land management decisions and activities, and using agriculture as a facilitator of change, if you will, and using it to the benefit. So thinking about, if you have lands that you would like to restore to native prairie, but they're in production, how can you still use the production aspects in the short term to regenerate that landscape, let's say soils, for instance, to produce conditions that would be conducive towards restoration of those lands in the future. And so this NIFA grant that we worked under was basically geared towards doing that. And one of the successes that I think came out of this is something that we are helping a producer kind of make that transition, and helping them understand, the steps that they can take to implement more regenerative ag practices. And Stefanie, if you could, next slide, please. And so one of the studies that are now coming out of the NIFA grant was, we were working with a producer in the Weippe Prairie area on a manure management study. And so we had this producer that was interested in understanding or finding ways to do more cover cropping, because they had little success with cover crops, but they were working with NRCS on a manure management project. And specifically, it was about winter storage of manure for their cattle. And NRCS was coming at it from a point of view of water quality, and then using that manure to offset or minimize the artificial inputs of fertilizer to their landscape. And so they would be storing this manure and then using it on their landscape as a means of natural fertilization, and trying to minimize the non-natural inputs. And so we saw this as an opportunity to work with the producer and kind of ask a few more questions, because the producer was wondering, well, if I am spreading this manure out on the landscape, am I possibly spreading weeds? And is there a better way for me to process the manure to minimize my cost of handling and distributing this manure across the landscape? And is there an opportunity to use this manure to augment my fields to produce better cover crops? And we took it a step further, making this line up with climate smart ag and asking, well, how can we also measure and monitor the greenhouse gas outputs from this manure management system and do some modeling to show under which conditions do you minimize your greenhouse gas profile and you're becoming more climate smart, so that you're actually meeting the mitigation pillar while also meeting the pillar of production or intensification, or producing more fiber off your landscape from doing that. And so we have just started that trial. In fact, the producer collected his first round of manure and is composting it through the summer. And then next year we'll be doing these field trials moving forward. And Stefanie, next slide, please.
And Eric, we're gonna have just one more, well, great. I'm glad this is the last slide, but if you could just wrap it up real quick, that would be great.
And that's it. Yep. So I was just going to say thank you. And I saw some questions in the chat, and I will answer those if we don't have time to answer them via the Zoom.
Excellent. That's so much information in such a brief period of time. Thank you. That was fantastic. I think you answered a lot of the questions in the chat, but Megan, if you wanted to bring one question in particular into this live conversation, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll go back to I think there were some questions for the first presenter. So in the first example from Stefanie, where did this farmer learn, like where did this farmer go for information for new practices? And then in general on the reservation, kind of what percentage use traditional, I think they mean conventional tilling systems.
Okay, so on the reservation, as Eric was saying, the adoption rate of no-till or partial till is 80 to 85%. That is tremendous compared to the surrounding landscape, where it's only about 20%. That was the result of the tribe working with the soil conservation districts and the NRCS to actually help provide the equipment to do no-till and education about how to do it. So there's a center where people can come and get their no-till equipment. And the skin in the game for the tribe is water quality, right? So this was all done through our non-point source pollution program. But, you know, as Eric pointed out, this is extremely interesting. Like, this was actually successful and shows how collaborations can make a big difference. And I think, you know, the farmer that I was speaking about, Eric Hasselstrom, you know, it's through his network that I think he learned. You know, I think he is a very curious person, and, you know, reads a lot and has gone to other, you know, alternative conferences. The Soil Conservation District in Lewis County has brought in some speakers to talk about soil health in a different way. Like, they brought in Christine Jones, who's this incredible expert on, you know, how to increase the biology of your soil and soil diversity. And so I think, you know, the sort of county education resources have been a help, but like the Jacksons that we're working with and you know, they were mentioning that they get almost all their information from seed companies. And, you know, it's not like they're going to the Eco Farm conference or the Regenerate conference or climate conferences like tribal staff are. You know, I would like to see a situation where we could sponsor producers to go to some of these conferences in different places and speak to producers who are doing different things. For instance, if we're going to get the climate of California, it makes sense to me for our producers to go talk to California farmers and learn what they're doing. Yeah, so the bioactive system that Eric's using, you know, it took him 4 years of asking questions and studying it before he decided to take the plunge and actually do it. I wish we'd met him before he decided to do that, because I feel like we could have probably gotten him some federal funding to help him buy the system. But he has pointed out that it's better for farmers to have some skin in the game and, you know, to put some of their own money on the line, and that it takes a lot of management, and he was already used to doing a lot of the management that really makes it effective. But now his neighbors want to do what he did.
I love this.
It's amazing, you know.
Thank you so much, Stefanie. I really appreciate it. I wish we had more time to keep going, but we've got another great example that we're going to move into. Thank you so much both for presenting. And there's just so much rich information in your work that I look forward to people digging into. And with that, I think we're going to shift to Larry Martin and Emmerich, if you'll be able to pull up that presentation. Larry grew up on a diversified grain and livestock farm in Missouri and farmed there with his father and brother in the 80s before buying a farm in southern Iowa in the 90s where he ran a cow-calf operation. Larry and his wife Sophia and 3 daughters moved to Oregon over 20 years ago and have operated a grass-based operation where he currently produces over 40 head of grass-finished yearlings a year marketed directly to his customers. Thanks, Larry.
Good morning, everyone. So as far as climate resilience on my operation, that means how do I adapt to drought and the extra heat that we're getting. My farm is located in the boundaries of Rogue River Valley Irrigation District, which is my source of irrigation water. The vast majority, I also rent some land. We operate over 100 acres and most of that is irrigated. So our irrigation seasons have been reduced the last 3 years because of drought, because of reservoir levels and just less rainfall than average. So we've had 3 years of it, and coming up this next year, our reservoir levels are probably the lowest they've ever been since the dams were built many decades ago. So we're actually looking at the potential of an even worse year next year. So I'm already trying to adapt to what is possible to happen next year. So in terms of dealing with drought with my cattle operation, the first thing that cattlemen should consider doing is reducing, if they know they're going to have a drought, probably the first thing they should think about is reducing their cow numbers. And we have, at one time we were running over 40 cows that produced all the calves that we finished, but I have cut back my cow herd some, and I've been buying some calves in the fall to maintain my production levels in terms of the animals I'm selling. So I haven't seen a hit to my gross income. Obviously, I have expense for those calves, but that's one way that I've adapted. In terms of the way I manage my farm, I was exposed to rotational grazing practices and back in the 80s when I was in Missouri, and then I practiced that there, and then in Iowa, and then set up a rotational grazing system on my farm. And when we go through the slides, we'll see a little bit of that. And that has enabled me to kind of more efficiently use the water that I have, get more production, higher quality, have it available to my yearlings in a way that I can get the gains to get those animals sufficiently finished to produce a good product. So why don't we go through the slides real quick. The first 3 pictures are pictures that I took last Sunday. So we've had roughly a half an inch of rain in the last 40 days since the irrigation water ended in early September. And these paddocks have been grazed or have rested roughly somewhere between 50 and 65 days since the last time they were grazed, which that rest period to me is really the key number to kind of see how you're doing in a rotational grazing system. So the first picture was my yearlings. This picture is one set of cows and calves and bred heifers, and the next picture is a group of cows and calves on some rented pasture. So I wasn't really planning on having water till September. Our reservoirs were low early in the year, but the spring rains and stream flows helped us. Actually, we're in much better shape than what I thought we would be. So I'll have grass well into November. And then the last 4 pictures are pictures that we snatched from my website. if you want to look at more, and then I have a lot of pictures on my blog, it's actually Martin Family Ranch is the name to go to if you're going to do to find my website. So the last picture is typical of the kind of quality of yearlings that I market to my customers. I think this steer produced a carcass of 750 pounds, probably graded close to choice. Our product's been well received. We've been doing it for almost 20 years, and it is an economically viable operation. We're certainly not getting rich, but at least we're sustainable financially. So one other thing that I've kind of talked about the rotational grazing as one way to help maximize the use of your water. I also have started to try to convert more to white-hided cattle to deal with the heat. You'll see a difference in behavior on the white-hided cattle versus especially the black-hided cattle. So that's another thing I've done to adapt to the increase in the number of hot days that we have that create stress on the animals. So I guess the other thing I'd like to touch on is kind of on a larger scale. I'm actually on the board of Rogue River Valley Irrigation District, and we had a pretty significant piping project that we got in the ground 2 or 3 years ago. We piped one of our open canals. We have another project kind of in the works that we're trying to raise money for that also will pipe another canal. I know the folks up in Central Oregon have been ahead of us in this regard. They have actually more poor soils than we do, so they had more of a motivation, but we're trying to catch up to some of the things they've done. So that on a bigger scale, converting flood to sprinkler irrigation, piping canals is going to help kind of the overall supply of water or the usage of the water that we have in our area. Our district, thanks to the piping project and some other things that we've done, we had water a little longer this summer than the other 2 main irrigation districts in our valley. So we're seeing some of those benefits, but we need to do more in that regard. So I'd be happy to take questions, or if you want me to expound on something else, just let me know.
Let's start with questions. Thank you so much, Larry. I really appreciate both you showing what's happening on your ranch, as well as talking about the irrigation district that you're involved with. Megan, if you want to share some of the questions, we have a couple minutes.
Yeah, there's just a couple here in the chat. So Larry, have you had to put any new shade structures or additional shade structures up in recent years? And then related to that, kind of which breeds are white-hided and what did you switch to?
Yeah, in terms of shade, I have limited shade in my paddocks. There are very few trees on the farm that we have and the ones that we rent. I tend to try to kind of save a few of those paddocks that do have shade for the days when we have over 100-degree days or 110. So when it's just terribly hot, I do try to move the cattle into those paddocks or give them access to shade. But if it's 100 degrees or less, the cattle do obviously have some stress, but I don't really think it's enough to make it worth trying to put up portable shade. The bulls that I use that has helped us convert to some white-hide cattle is I have done a lot of AI in the past, and I found a Charolais bull that was smaller framed and easier flushing with good marbling, kind of high on fat EPDs, and that particular bull worked really well, and I've saved some calves out of him, and then their progeny. Fortunately, at least from my point of view, white-hided cattle are dominant to black-hided cattle. So if I can pass that white gene on, it'll turn a black-hided cow into producing a white calf if I get that gene to come through. So that's that's the bull that I used that's going to continue to influence the color of my cattle.
And then a question from Cheyenne. So he has emailed with you about testing warm season forage species and eastern gamma grass. But do you have anything more to share about testing warm season forages or some experiments you've done with trying different drought resilient forages on either of the pastures?
Yes, I did plant a field of eastern gamma grass within the first year or two that we moved here, almost 20 years ago. And there's actually a picture of that field on my website. But I think eastern gamma grass is probably a little better adapted to climates where they have a dormant season in the winter. It didn't compete as well with the winter annuals. And the other kind of limiting factor on eastern gamma grass is you can't graze it as early in the spring, and you have to get off of it earlier in the fall. So I just found that field was more productive for me if it was in cool season grasses and legumes. So I just kind of let that stand fizzle out on me and put it back into the more conventional cool season grasses.
So Larry, you're one of the best grazers down here in the Rogue Valley, or at least the most like sophisticated with how you approach your operation, and have hosted quite a few workshops and tours amongst the conservation agriculture community down here. And in those tours and kind of questions that you've received from other grazers in our area, what do you see are kind of the greatest opportunities for working with producers to transition their systems to something more regenerative, less conventional?
Well, I wish I had the answer to that. I've been doing this for 40 years, and it's not, rotational grazing hasn't been as widely accepted as I thought it would be. It's frustrating to me to drive around the valley and see pastures that are just nubbed down to the ground. But I don't know. I mean, I try to do my part by hosting field days, but I don't know what the magic bullet is to get people to get with the program.
Thanks, Larry. I think showing what's happening on your farm is one of the best tools that we have. I really appreciate all the work that you're doing and this extra work working with the irrigation management district. And I know you'll have to leave early to go to one of those meetings, so I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And I think with that, we're going to move into sharing with Powell and Katie Swanson on no and low till practices as a water conservation tool. Again, hitting water as a main theme. Powell is a faculty member in the OSU Extension Small Farms program in Southern Oregon and is the state coordinator for the Western SARE Professional Development Program. Definitely a huge help on our planning team for this event. She and her family also own and operate Wolf Gulch Farm, a certified organic seed farm. And she'll be presenting with Katie Swanson, who owns and operates Sweet Union Farm, a small-scale mixed veggie farm in Klamath Falls. Katie is also co-founder and director of the community relations for the nonprofit food hub Klamath Grown. Thanks, Maud and Katie.
Thanks, Ashley, for inviting us to present. Hi, everybody. So Katie and I are going to tell you a little bit about a project we've been working on. This was Katie's brainchild and is funded through a Western SARE Farmer Rancher grant. The application deadline for this year is in like 2 weeks. So if you can scramble and pull something together, it's a great opportunity to work directly with farmers and do some applied research. So as you can see, the title of this project is No Low-Till Practices as a Water Conservation Tool on Small-Scale Vegetable Farms East of the Cascades. And we received the grant this spring, and it's just a one-year grant. So Katie is awesome. I'm serving as her technical advisor, but it's just wonderful to work with a producer like Katie, who's a great project manager. and got the other 4 farmers that are involved in the project rolling in the spring. And then we'll actually be wrapping up the grant this coming March. So just a 1-year project. Katie and the other farmers will be presenting on a panel at the Small Farms Conference in February. So just want to make a plug for that conference. We'll have a whole track on climate resilient farming then. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Katie for the next slide.
Thanks, Maud. Thanks for having us. Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about how we designed the project. Yeah, I came to Maud with an idea and she helped me actually make it into a project. So yeah, we really focused in on small scale mixed vegetable farms located east of the Cascades. I myself operate a small scale vegetable farm in Klamath Falls. So that was where my interest was. And all of these farms essentially are in the high desert. So they are dealing with lots of the extreme weather that we're talking about already, and then exacerbated by climate change. So they're good people to talk to. We prioritize compensating the farmers for their time, which turned out to be pretty important in just moving the project along and getting the data that we needed. And I'm a farmer, I'm not a scientist. So the case study approach worked better for me and really allowed some flexibility for the farmers. So rather than having everything the same at all the farms, the case study approach allowed the farmers to choose what crop they were testing and the details of their bed prep. Since a lot of people have different definitions of tillage and they use tools differently based on their soil type and their situation, we felt that letting them make some decisions was going to work better and be more useful for the farmers. So essentially, they were they were prepping the beds in 3 different ways. So they had 3 different trial beds, one that was no-till, one that was low-till, and one that used tillage. Basically they were given soil water tension sensors. They're watermark sensors, and they had 3 sensors for each bed. So they were able to measure soil water tension at 3 different depths for the no-till bed, the tilled bed, and the low-till bed. And the depths depended on which crop they chose based on the root zone. And we did soil water tension instead of just soil water content, because the water tension will tell you how hard the plant roots need to work to access the water that's in the soil, rather than just telling you how much water is in the soil. And everybody got weather stations too, so we could kind of see the sensor data and correlate that with any extreme weather events or anything like that. And really, we were just looking to see what the differences were in the soil water retention between these 3 different types of bed prep methods. So that was kind of the research side of things. And then for the video demonstrations were really meant to allow the farmers to share their experience in the season, because farmers don't have time to visit each other or see each other's farms. So we visited all the farms and took video, did interviews, took pictures, so that this fall and winter we can get together and we can share with each other. And then also we'll be able to use all of that same material to share more broadly with people outside the project. Yeah, so anyway, so the 5 farms we'll introduce. We can go to the next slide. So like I said, all of the farms are in the high desert. They're about 3,000 or 4,000 feet in elevation, 10 to 12 inches in annual precipitation. So it's pretty dry. They're all dependent on snow melt for irrigation. So there's a lot of similarities. So this first one is Fibonacci Farm. This is Aaron and Lauren farmed together And they are leasing about 2 acres. They actually lease 2 different properties, and this is one of them where they had the trials. They're located in Central Oregon and just outside of Bend. This is their 2nd year, so they're very new. They actually graduated from the Rogue Farm Corps, one of the Rogue Farm Corps programs a couple of years ago. They do mixed veggie and flowers, mostly sell at the farmers market. And their water situation, they actually are on the Central Oregon Irrigation District, which is the most reliable in the region, has the most senior water rights. And they use a storage pond to hold the water that they receive through the irrigation district, and then distribute that through mostly drip systems on the farm.
So the second farm that participated in the project is Sun Grounded Farm, which is in Terrebonne in Central Oregon as well. They are in their 4th year of production and growing about 1.5 acres. They're actually right by Smith Rock. It's a really amazingly dramatic farm to visit because you just have Smith Rock right there as the backdrop. They're also producing mixed vegetables, mostly producing for farmers markets, CSA and wholesale. They are also receive their irrigation through the Central Oregon Irrigation District, which they collect in a pond, and they receive irrigation once a week for about 10 hours. And then they're irrigating overhead in the fields and then drip. They've got quite a few tunnels, so they're doing drip in the tunnels.
All right, that's me. I'm Sweet Union Farm. So I previously was on a few different leased properties in addition to my own to make up about 2/3 of an acre. But I just moved this season to 7.5 acres that are all my own. So my farm is in transition. So I actually ended up doing my trials in my home garden at the new property. So it was a little bit of a funky year for me. But anyway, so yeah, this is my 6th season. I do mixed vegetables, mostly for CSA, as well as the online market run by the Food Hub that I'm a part of, and restaurant. So in my past, my last farm, old farm, I don't know what to call it. I was on an irrigation district that was, it was pretty low priority. And so I usually didn't get irrigation water, but I also was on city water. So I was able to do that. And I was on a small enough scale to make that work, even though it was expensive. And on my new property, I will be 100% dependent on irrigation, ditch water from Klamath Irrigation District, which historically has been one of the best. And in the last 3 years last year, nobody got any water from KID. So I'm kind of transitioning to be reliant on that. I do mostly drip with a little bit of overhead.
The 4th farm is Sakari Farm, which is a 1.5 acre tribal farm in Tumalo in Central Oregon as well. This is Spring, Alaska. She and her partner and their crew are producing native foods for both value-added products and then also food donations to tribal entities. I believe the Warm Springs and then and the Silettes and Grand Ronde as well. So they are on a smaller irrigation, the Tumalo Irrigation District, which is intermittent and has earlier shutoffs. So they use a storage pond. They use a lot of tunnels. They're doing a lot of their production in tunnels with drip and then a little bit of overhead.
All right, and this is the last farm, all the way in Eastern Oregon in Cove, Nella May. Nella May is growing on about 1/2 acre, partially her property and another leased property. And so Cove, if you don't know where it is, it's a little bit south of La Grande. She's been doing this for about 9 years, mixed vegetables, mostly sold at her farm stand in the farmer's market. and then does some wholesale as well. Even though her climate is fairly similar, she actually has a much better water situation than the other 4 farms on this project. She has ample groundwater and really doesn't have a lot of limitations, but she's using the well, and as you can see, she does a lot of drip, but also there's some overhead with micro sprinklers and things like that in the tunnels.
So Katie and I went and did visits with all these farms in September and got some initial kind of feedback on how the trialing went. We are working with Lucas Niebert, who's doing data analysis. So we don't have all of those results yet, but I think Katie's going to talk a little bit about some of the initial impressions and observations. But I just want to mention a little bit about some of the challenges that we faced as a project. Obviously, we designed the research component to be on farm, applied, and easy for the farmers to actually do within the context of running a commercial farm in droughty conditions. And so one of the biggest challenges that people commented on is that they put their beds in the 3 trialing beds, but there were often variables they couldn't account for. So this is a photo from let's see, this is sun grounded, am I right? Yes. No, sorry, this is Sakari. And you can see over this, they trialed beets on there. That was the crop they chose. So you can see these beets in the foreground. And on the left, you can see there's a row of bachelor buttons. And so that the leftmost bed was impacted by the fact that there was a row of bachelor buttons. So the amount of irrigation they got was a little bit different. So that was just, that was an example of one of those challenges that we saw in terms of variabilities within the farm. And then, of course, because we had 5 different crops that were chosen, there was variability amongst the farms or across the farms. So it was easier for the farmers, but the data may not be quite as helpful. And then I would say the other bigger issue is that these producers are all kind of facing larger systemic water policy challenges. And so whether they were low till, no till, or tilling just seemed sort of like a drop in the bucket, so to speak, in terms of how much water delivery they had and the challenges they were facing with irrigation districts and early shutoffs. It just felt like we're not necessarily addressing the bigger causes to why people don't have enough water. So Katie, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I don't think so. That's great. All right, so successes. So like Maud said, we're not done yet, but these are things that we've noticed so far. Everybody we talked to definitely just noticed they were a lot more aware and intentional with their irrigation practices because they had these sensors. They were taking readings once a week at least, and some of them did, like the requirement was once a week, but some of them did more because they were using them to just check on the status of their beds. And so, yeah, they just said they were a lot more intentional about their irrigation decisions. And in some ways, even if it didn't affect their decisions, it kind of affirmed what they were doing. Or when there was like a really, really hot week and they had already used up all the water in their pond and they just had to kind of watch the plants, the sensors actually, sometimes the readings weren't as bad as they thought. And it was kind of comforting. So to ensure that the plants were going to be okay. And they all want to use the tensiometers in the future. They all, found them helpful and are excited to use them again. The data isn't all compiled yet, but so far there are clear results on 2 of the farms that the no-till beds did hold moisture better. The other ones are a little less obvious, but I consider that a win. And then the other piece is just, I guess we anticipate this success. We kind of already see it happening when we were visiting everybody, but just kind of using this cohort to build a network of farmers that are facing similar challenges to each other, to share best practices. And like I said before, I think there's a lot of, these farmers are climate resilient. They're already doing a lot of really cool stuff and they don't even know it. So I think it's helpful for them to talk to each other and share what they're doing, and kind of spread those ideas around. And yeah.
Cool. And then our last slide, we just wanted to give some final thoughts. So the part as an ag professional that I found the most interesting, actually, I'm actually not going to talk about these in order, but in terms of producer behavior change, what we saw was that by actually buying the tensiometers for these farmers and then actually paying them to pay attention, they learned how to use the tensiometers. And a number of them spoke about how, you know, their tensiometer was sitting in its box for a long time, and they kept, like, it was the last thing they wanted to do. They're in the spring and they're planting, and, you know, they know they have to do this one piece for the grant. But there was kind of just the resistance that happens to learning a new piece of equipment and adding that in when you're already feeling so slammed. And so that was just really interesting for me to see that all of the producers talked about what a useful piece of equipment was, how much it was helping to inform their irrigation scheduling, and how they wanted to use it in the future. And yet there was that resistance to the initial adoption. And so writing them into the grant, making them feel like their participation was needed and expected, and they were being paid for it, so they better come through with the data. So that kind of carrot stick combination was really interesting to see. And then just being really excited that people wanted to continue using them. Like I said, we also noticed how many of the producers, I think they're all considered beginning farmers, or all within their first 10 years of farming, how excited they were to be invited into doing participatory research. They were honored. It meant a lot to them to be included in this project and then to be part of this network, as Katie mentioned. So those were like sort of the standout takeaways from those farm visits that I had. Just also wanted to mention that, yeah, Sakari Farm was doing the no-till in single season crops, and talked about how much easier that was. So that was just sort of a note. And then, as I mentioned, they're all beginning farmers, and just really realizing and hearing from them how in this more difficult condition with variable irrigation and limited water, just that real need for extra resources to get a farm up and running and to be economically viable. And then finally, and Katie really noted this, because I believe a friend of hers who's a rancher has a tensiometer that's mobile, that's simpler. I think you just stick it into the ground and are able to get a reading on water tension. And so realizing that would actually probably be a more user-friendly type of tensiometer for producers. So just looking at, yeah, the very varying types of equipment. I can't remember, Katie, how you came to decide to purchase the ones you did, but then just looking at that critically and realizing, you know, the readings might be slightly less accurate, but producers are actually going to use them more if they're simpler. And that's the presentation. So, and yeah, Katie, add anything you want, and then we can.
Yeah, I was just going to mention kind of the difference between the tensiometer that you just stick in the ground and the sensors that we used. The sensors we used, you can be more accurate with the depth, and they stay in the ground all season, and then you just take a reading every week. So it is a little bit better for like a long-term research project like this. The tensiometer allows somebody to just walk around their field and stick it in and look at the reading wherever they want. So just kind of different uses, but I think maybe in the future it might, if they're not doing an active research project, the mobile tensiometer might be a little bit better.
Thank you all so much for that really comprehensive presentation, and like sharing information on so many different farms in a short period of time. I think we're going to save questions for after Pryor's presentation to make sure that we have enough time for Pryor. But there are just a couple little questions in the chat that if you feel like answering, but I felt like you really covered so many of the critical points. So thank you so much. And with that, I think we're going to shift to Pryor Garnett from Garnetts Red Prairie Farms. Pryor is an organic farmer of small grains and legumes in the Western Willamette Valley, a former patent lawyer, on the boards of the Polk Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as the Oregon Startup Center, and chair of the National Organic Farmers Association Policy Committee. Pryor, feel free to share your screen, and we'll be able to share Pryor's full presentation with everyone after the session as well. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me and see the screen all right, Ashley? Yep, I see heads nodding. Okay. So in 10 minutes, I'm going to tell you all about being a beginning certified organic farmer in Western Oregon, not doing vegetables. I'm going to talk about 4 things very quickly: worms, weeds, woods, and water. We have water. We have plenty of water here. However, we have no irrigation, and that constrains a lot of what I do. This is a picture of the farm. It is on not high quality soil. This is not the deep Willamette soils that we know and love. It's heavy, low pH, low organic matter, poor soil structure, and a perched water table with no aquifer below it. The picture you see is the current farm, and the presentation does a time lapse through the whole life of the farm for about the last 100 years, but I'll just show you the difference between now and the next slide, which is what it was about 90 years ago. No woods to speak of, heavily grazed. It was hay, sheep, and in the time between then and now, after the sheep left, the woods came back. And I'm going to click through all of that. You can look at it more. Currently, I now farm all of my plot in a small field rented from a neighbor in certified organic grains with the rotations that requires, no irrigation. So if it's certified organic, I can't use fertilizer. I also choose not to import manure. I'm trying to keep my supply chains just as short and close as possible. So I have to grow or raise my own nitrogen. That means cover crops. You see here a picture of a cover crop of buckwheat to protect the soil, and all of my residue gets turned back in. I do not bail off any residue at all. I need that all for the worms and the other soil biology. Weeds. This is probably my biggest challenge because being a certified organic means I can't spray. I would love to be no-till, but most of the folks that are doing no-till in Oregon are doing chem no-till. It's very rare to find someone who is doing organic no-till. It's much, much harder because of the weeds. I keep my soil covered as much of the time as I can with cover crops. I take great care to preserve the soil, planting in weird patterns like key lines or contours to minimize soil erosion. But tillage is just unavoidable so far. It is, however, something that I minimize. Here you can see a field where it's really on the top of a hill. I don't know if you can see the contours on your screens, but the red line is a tillage, planting AV line that I use to go around the contours and make sure that most of my planted rows are in fact going across the field contours and not down where they can channel water. I do the same thing with my tillage because when I till, the rows that I leave behind become channels for water in the off season. I do a lot of experimenting, and sometimes those experiments are unintentional, as when there's a goof, but Here you can see a picture of an intentional one. This is taken from across the road looking up into one of my fields. The stripes that you see are two different varieties of malting barley that I put in last fall. Across the contour of the field, alternating two different varieties going up the hill. I had about 10 acres in total of malting barley, and I wanted to see if either of them performed better or worse in the western Willamette Valley. As it turns out, their performance was almost identical, although I had real concerns about the variety from Colorado. It came through in the end. There's an awful lot of experimentation that I do here on the farm. I have woods. Oh, actually, let me go back to one more thing about the weeds here. I mentioned that I am not no-till, but I aspire to be. I've got the no-till drill to do it with, and I am minimizing the tillage to the extent possible. One of the reasons that a lot of farmers in the western part of Oregon say that they can't go organic no-till or no-till at all is because of slugs. That mat of decomposing dry vegetation provides slug habitat, and that's a real problem. That's a real problem for some. In the future, I hope to be able to do that, and one of the controls that I may well use is poultry, pastured poultry, who are probably better at picking up slug eggs and slugs than just about any other control that I can think of that's not a chemical. Plus, you get the benefit of the manure for soil fertility and, of course, another income stream. That's a ways in the future, but I think we'll see it work. I do have woods, and there we go. They're important. I don't intend to turn them back into sheep pasture the way the farm was almost 100 years ago. The wildfire threat here is increasing, which means woods can't just be allowed to go feral. You can end up with some pretty high fuel loads there. Wildlife habitat is shrinking. Most of my neighbors do not have a lot of space that they allow wildlife to thrive in. Christmas tree farms, for example, around me, they're dead zones as far as wildlife go. And finally, carbon sequestration is done best on wooded area. You can put carbon into soil with residue reincorporation, but it's very easy to get that carbon right back out the first time you till again. Whereas with woods, once the wood has grown, it's pretty well sequestered unless you burn it. I will be treating my woods to rehabilitate them. They have become greatly overgrown. You can see that there's a lot of conifer infestation, overcrowding, a thick understory. And with the help of NRCS and the Soil and Water Conservation District, I will be coming in to thin the oaks, remove the conifers, and hopefully produce a healthier forest that actually provides additional habitat as well. The other thing we've done extensively is pollinator-friendly hedgerows to feed both native pollinators and honeybees. Not that small grains necessarily require pollination, but cover crops certainly do. Buckwheat is one of my absolute favorite cover crops, and it is a flowering plant. Peas, legumes, even vetch, all require pollination, and those require pollinators. I don't intend to import bees, so I'm looking for the natives to do the work for me. Feeding them in the off years when I'm not growing flowering plants, I put in 3/4 of a mile of hedgerow, flowering shrubs, both along the roadside, as you can see here, and also along both sides of the creek that runs through. And those have been done very, very well with really minimal effort and maintenance, other than the first year when they needed water to get themselves established. Yeah, there you can see a newly planted one going in right along the creek with my son, actually. And there's one after just 1 year. Water is the last thing I'll talk about. I mentioned that I'm on rather poor soil with no groundwater and no water rights. So I rely on water retention extensively to keep things under control. I keep as much soil organic matter in my soil as I possibly can, not just to feed the soil biology, but it helps absorb heavy rains. And we get very heavy rains here occasionally in the winter, deluges. And if I don't have the soil protected, that's going to take everything right off and down into the creek. I have field borders and swales around every field. That, again, helps prevent soil erosion on the downhill sides. It also provides habitat for wildlife, and especially for small wildlife and soil friendly beetles and the like. So I'm a great believer in field borders. Now, we're getting drier. Our summer is getting longer and drier. Of course, you've heard from other speakers, we're seeing hotter extremes. I would like to store water, and I have the opportunity to, just from the topology of the ground, to store water and be able to use it on site. Of course, that requires water rights, water applications. It's a big project, never mind the construction, but the benefits would be huge, not just in irrigation. That water would be available for firefighting. And that's something that is of great concern to me and my neighbors. And it would also be available for wetland preservation. Downhill from a reservoir, you'll find little steeps, and those wetlands are currently drying out in the summer. It would be wonderful to be able to have them wet year round. I think the wildlife benefits of that would be immense. And with that, I will say thank you and invite any questions.
Thank you so much, Pryor. Megan, if you want to grab a question or maybe two from the chat, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Let's see. What cover crops have worked best for you for supplying nitrogen? And then have you tried any methods of estimating the amount of nitrogen they're contributing?
That's a good question, Nick. Thank you. I like common vetch. It does well here. I've used winter pea in the past. In this environment, after 1 year, it tends to fade out. And if you plant it maybe another 2 or 3 years later, it doesn't do as well. I suspect that there is a pathogen issue that's making it difficult. Longer rotation would be necessary. But common vetch has done very well for me. It also terminates really easily. Have I tried estimating their nitrogen contribution? Yes, in a crude way, but not scientifically.
And then kind of an economics question. So how are these practices contributing to your bottom line or your profits in comparison to maybe what you'd be looking at with a more conventional approach?
Intangibly, I think that they're contributing by shortening my supply chain and reducing my need to purchase off-farm inputs. That is a long-term strategy that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. I don't have an A/B test that I can use to compare being conventional versus being certified organic. So I can't say that I'm doing well or poorly. These fields are still in transition from being farmed conventionally for grass seed for 3 or 4 decades. I don't expect their soil biology to get to the point where they are sustainably certified organic for another 3 or 4 years. I gave myself 10 years before I expected the soils to actually be in a steady state of sustainability. So if you could hold that question and ask me again in a couple of years, I hope to have an answer for you, at least on how the A part of the test is working. As for the B part of the test, there are lots of conventional growers here in the Willamette Valley that can tell you how they're doing.
With that, I think we're going to close this part of the session. Thank you so much, Pryor, and all of the other presenters for sharing your story. I know it's not enough time to really capture everything that you're doing on your farms and in partnership with other farms. We have just 1 or 2 minutes to have a partner bring in a quick request for collaboration. I'm going to let Barrett share a little bit of a project that she's working on, because it seemed like folks in this room would be really interested. Go ahead, Barrett.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone that put this together and all the speakers. This has been just really interesting and very informative. Some of you I've already spoken to, so this isn't your first time hearing about this project. But for those of you that don't know me, my name is Barrett Nelson. I'm a postdoc researcher at OSU. I'm working under Maria Zamora-Ray and Abigail Tomasek. And the grant we're working on is actually very interesting and I think very relevant to what you all are doing. We were given some funds by the state in 2021 as part of the disaster relief fund. And essentially what the state is asking us to do is to assess what farmers all across the state and in all commodities are doing on farm right now to deal with drought and heat. And then also perhaps more importantly, what they would like to do moving forward. So this is a fairly unique opportunity in the sense that at the end of the project, we'll be presenting those findings to the state legislature. So the request that I'm putting out there today is that I provided Ashley with a very short call that could be sent to producers, just asking them to participate in very brief interviews with us. They're about 30 minutes long. And again, we're just asking people, what are you doing and what would you like to do? It's really critical that we have direct farmer engagement in this. I've heard a few people say, you know, we all have really great ideas and we know what we think needs to be done. But if farmers aren't on board with the idea, it's not going to go anywhere. And it ends up being a huge waste of time and money. So we really want to give people the opportunity to be honest and tell the state what they would really like some help with. And that could be a wide gamut of things from, you know, policy changes to funding for things like tensiometers. I mean, all these great ideas that you all have put out there. So I won't say I'm begging, but I am begging you to please consider sending that out to any producers that you know that might be willing to work with us. And we'd be really grateful for that. And I'll pop my email into the chat. So if you have any questions or want some more information, I'm happy to share that. So thank you so much again. I really appreciate the time.
Thank you, Barrett. And with that, we're going to transition into our regional breakout rooms here in a minute. I know folks have been sitting for a long time, so if you feel the need now, you can listen to me while you get, you know, stand up and stretch a little bit. And we don't have, you know, set aside break time. So as you go into your breakout rooms, please feel free to take care of yourself. Go take a quick break if you need to. We've got a nice chunk of about 20 minutes for the regional breakout rooms. And what we're going to do today is pick up where we left off with session 1 in the work groups. Not everybody had enough time to get through all of the questions. And I feel like the topics that we covered in the first session really blend nicely with these examples that are happening in the third session. So if you manage to get through all of your questions in the first session work group, there's additional questions for you to reflect on session 3. And what's going to be a little bit different about these breakout rooms from the very first ones that we started with is that you get to choose where you're going to go. You're going to choose what work group fits, you know, where you're working, if that's statewide or if that's regional. And there are facilitated questions. Again, we're going to be using the same worksheets that we did last time. And Megan just put a link to those discussion guides in the chat. So you can open that up and head to the different questions. And I'll give folks a minute to kind of click through there. Hopefully, once you get into those rooms, you all can pick a facilitator and a note taker, and that facilitator can help get you through the questions. So for those of you having problems accessing that worksheet, hopefully at least one other person in your group will be able to get that. And if you're having problems finding it, it's also in the agenda that Emmerich sent around to you yesterday. And that will have a link to the discussion questions there too. So a couple different ways to find the information. And then I'll just share with you what the different regional breakout rooms look like. Can you all see that? Oh, nope. There we go. These are the different breakout rooms that you'll get to choose. And Emmerich, if you feel ready to set up those breakout rooms, we can go ahead and jump in. Thank you all. I think this is an important time to build our community of practice on the ground.
All right, so those rooms have just opened up. If you are having difficulty choosing the room that you need to get into, just let Ashley or I know. You can put in the chat which room you need to be in, and we'll help move you in there. And I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording.
Welcome back, everybody. I'm seeing folks almost all trickle in. Thank you so much. Can I get a quick feel of how those went? Can I get a thumbs up, a kind of medium thumbs down? All right. I know it's never enough time in those sessions, or I hope at least that maybe wasn't enough time. But this is really just meant to be a touchstone for you all to get to know each other so that you can connect after the session. Thanks again today to all of the speakers. I'm just so thankful for the huge depth of knowledge that was shared today. I think, Emmerich and I were discussing while you were all in the breakout rooms, a few themes that really came across for us. One idea is that behavior change is hard, right? And we were talking a lot about that, I think, in each one of the different speakers, and people come to changing how they're going to manage the land in lots of different ways. And it's going to take a lot of different pathways to find new creative solutions for dealing with the really challenging impacts of climate. I also really appreciate how the different creative ways that soil health was really brought to bear in dealing with water quality issues and dealing with limited access to water. So many creative ideas today that were shared. I really appreciate it, and a lot of great folks in this room. I'm excited for next Wednesday. We'll get started again at 9:30 for our final workshop, where we'll be looking at policy and market drivers for change on farms, looking at what are some of the systemic constraints that farmers are working within, and what are some pathways in those different systems that are being opened up or not for farmers to be able to have more support in implementing conservation practices. So super interested in that and the speakers that will be happening. And finally, I've got a little form. Let me do a quick copy of this form here. If you all have any feedback for us, it would be great if you want to go ahead and go to that form, and it's an anonymous form. You can let us know what's working for you and what's not. And if we could all just take one moment to give a nice clap for everyone who presented today. I really appreciate your time, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.